Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos introducing key concepts in international political economy. In this video, we're going to explore the concept of gross domestic product. Let's get started. Gross domestic product is the most common measure of development, and it's a fairly straightforward concept. Gross domestic product refers to the total value of goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. When you divide that by the population of a country, you get GDP per capita. Now remember that economic transactions are usually priced in local currency terms at current prices. To get numbers that are comparable, we have to convert those into a single currency, and most often we see them converted into the US dollar. When we do this, we get a figure that's referred to as nominal GDP. Nominal gross domestic product does not account for inflation or deflation, and it merely converts GDP in local currency terms from one country into US dollars using official exchange rates. By contrast, real gross domestic product, or real GDP, is calculated using a multiplier which accounts for rates of inflation or deflation. When possible, it's important to use real GDP when comparing economies over time. If we fail to account for inflation, real GDP would look very, very different. But why is this important? Let's think about an abstract example. On this graph, I'm showing a hypothetical country's per capita GDP over time. On the vertical axis, we see the nominal GDP per capita. On the horizontal, we've got 4 years, year 1, 2, 3, and 4. What's going on in this image? On the surface, it looks like we're seeing some remarkable economic growth beginning in year 3, but are we really? Let's contrast our hypothetical example, the blue line, with another hypothetical example, here a red line. It looks like country B, the red line, is doing better than country A, the blue line, until year 3 when the economy of country A took off. But what if I told you that the red line here shows the exact same level of economic activity in our hypothetical country? What's going on here? The difference we're seeing is the difference between nominal and real GDP over time. We're seeing the exact same level of economic activity, but we're seeing differences between nominal GDP per capita in blue and real GDP per capita in red. To get a sense, let's look at the numbers behind the lines. Let's say that we're looking at a country that produces widgets in its economy. In year 1, it produces 500 widgets that sell for $10 each. Its total GDP would be $5,000. In year 2, economic activity falls sharply, but prices increase or inflation occurs. The effect here is interesting. From a nominal perspective, the blue line looks like the economy is doing better, but in real terms, the red line, it's actually doing worse. In year 3, prices fall, but economic activity increases sharply. In real terms, it looks like we're better off than we've ever been before, but in nominal terms, we're no better off at all. And finally, in year 4, prices increase yet again. Think of runaway inflation. It looks like we're doing amazingly well, but in real terms, production is up steadily, but not dramatically. To get real GDP, we simply need to use constant dollars. In this example, I use year $3, but you could use any year. Real GDP gives us a better sense of actual production rather than being distracted by sharp increases or decreases in currency values. Thus, when we're thinking about development and changes in GDP over time, we should always be using real GDP. So now we know we should look to real GDP instead of nominal GDP to accurately measure changes over time. But what about comparing levels of development between countries? If we price GDP in local currency terms, we may have an accurate figure, but we can't compare it across countries. If we say that South Africa's GDP is about 71,000 rand, or that India's GDP per capita is about 81,000 rupee, what does that tell us? Not much. But we can convert it into US dollars. We learned that, at least in 2017, South Africa's per capita GDP was about $13,000 per person to make it 90th in the world, while India's was about $7,000 per person, or about 120th position in the world. Now we're in a better position to compare the two countries. To get at these figures, we can simply use currency exchange rates. But exchange rates sometimes fluctuate wildly, and even when they don't, we know that in general the cost of living in developed countries is higher than the cost of living in developing countries. As a result, GDP tends to make developing countries look poorer than developed countries. This is known as the Penn effect. But nominal currency conversions, which use official exchange rates that can fluctuate wildly, tend to understate the size of the economy in developing countries. This is known as the Penn effect, and it comes into practice because developing countries tend to have lower costs of living than developed countries. To get around this, economists will sometimes use purchasing power parity, or PPP, estimates. Rather than comparing economies using official currency conversion rates, PPP compares the price of a basket of goods and services and uses that as the basis for exchange, leading to more accurate comparisons. Think of it this way. A Big Mac in nominal terms costs about $6.57 in Switzerland, but only $1.75 in Egypt. It's the same thing, but it has very different prices. You can see the comparative figures if you look at The Economist's Big Mac Index. Because currency values can vary greatly from one country to another, purchasing power parity GDP looks at that basket of goods and services and uses local currency value of that basket to convert GDP figures. It overcomes the Penn effect by using a common set of goods as the balance of currency values, and it can have a big impact. Indeed, to get a sense of that impact, let's look at the variance between nominal and purchasing power GDPs reflected in this table. It gives you a sense of the difference between the two figures. Note the differences between the two numbers by country. For most developed countries, nominal GDP tends to overstate the size of the economy. Switzerland, for example, has a nominal GDP of more than $80,000, but it shrinks to just over $60,000 when we use purchasing power parity per capita, a drop of almost $20,000. Denmark drops by about $5,000 per person. This suggests that the cost of living in these countries is relatively high. By contrast, many developing countries, as reflected in the table here in South Africa, China, India, South Sudan, and others, have per capita purchasing power parity GDPs that are higher than their nominal GDPs per capita, suggesting that their currency is undervalued and reflecting a lower cost of living in each of those countries. For some, the difference is quite large. India's economy, for example, is effectively 3 times as large when measured using per capita purchasing power parity GDP as opposed to nominal GDP, and similarly Russia's economy more than triples in size. The difference between nominal and purchasing power parity GDP per capita is a reflection of the Penn effect. Gross domestic product is frequently used as a proxy for development, with different levels of GDP corresponding to different levels of development. But GDP suffers from a number of limits that challenge this use. GDP gives us no indication about the structure of an economy, only its size. What proportion of the economy is structured around manufacturing? How much of the economy is based around the export of a single primary commodity? Most countries would prefer to have a diversified economy, with some agriculture, some industry, and some service sectors all making contributions. But many developing countries are disproportionately dependent on agricultural production or the export of a single primary commodity. Saudi Arabia has a GDP per capita of about $55,000, yet its economy is almost entirely dependent on a single primary commodity, oil, for all of its export earnings and economic activity. Should Qatar be classified as a highly developed country, as a developing country? GDP really doesn't give us a good answer to this question. GDP also tells us nothing about the income distribution of a country. A society in which everyone is middle class and a society in which there are extremes of poverty accompanied by extremes of wealth can have equal levels of development in this respect. Qatar is a telling example. While the per capita GDP of the country is almost $100,000, foreign expatriates comprise nearly 20% of the total population of the country. Many of these are guest workers from countries like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, who work as domestic laborers and doing manual labor for extremely low wages. Just knowing that Qatar has a high GDP per capita doesn't give us a sense about how the people in the country actually live. The Gini index, a measure of inequality, gives us a better sense of this. Here we note that many developing countries are highly unequal. This map shows Gini coefficients from around the world. Note that most of the countries in red, the countries with the highest level of inequality, are located in the global south. However, I'd also pause to note that the Gini index doesn't tell us about the relative measures of wealth. A country like Ethiopia could have a relatively equal but very poor economy. In this situation, everyone is equally poor. This is a very different situation than a country like Sweden, where the economy is relatively rich and equal. GDP also tells us very little about broader underlying economic problems or issues. It treats all expenditures the same, whether that's a rich person purchasing a second yacht or 1,000 families spending their limited income on basic necessities. It still counts as the same amount towards GDP. What's more, GDP does not generally include informal sector activities or unpaid labor. In developing countries where much of the productive activity of the country takes place outside the formal economy, either illicitly through the informal economy or as subsistence household production, this means that a large proportion of economic activity remains unaccounted for. This exclusion carries gendered implications, as the work traditionally performed by women disproportionately is excluded from systems of national account like GDP. Similarly, subsistence farming activities, which can occupy the productive labor of the majority of the people in many developing countries, remains excluded from formal systems of national account because such labor is unpaid and therefore outside of the formal labor process. As a result, the GDP for many developing countries often understates the actual level of economic activity in those countries. And finally, GDP fails to account for externalities, that is, for costs of production that are not embodied in the price of that good. GDP is merely additive in that sense. When an oil well in the Gulf of Mexico springs a leak, the cost of cleaning that spill is added to the economy. Environmental damage is not deducted from the system of national accounts. This can lead to perverse outcomes where natural or human-generated disasters can actually register as positives for the economy. And sometimes it's difficult to even ensure that the figures themselves are accurate. In his groundbreaking book on economic activity in Africa, economic historian Morton Jervin of Simon Fraser University in Canada noted that even setting aside the problems imposed by modern conversion rates, there's considerable disagreement about the relative rankings of the size of national economies. Looking at the rankings of African economies for the year 2000, for example, Jervin observed that there are 3 different rankings, all of which purport to measure the exact same thing, the size of the national economy, but nevertheless arrive at very different conclusions. They all agree that the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly Zaire, was Africa's poorest country. But among the 10 poorest countries in Africa, in the 3 rankings, only 6 countries consistently peered: the DRC, Sierra Leone, Niger, Burundi, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. There was better agreement about the ranking of the 10 richest countries, but there's wide variation in the relative rankings in all categories. One, for example, rates Guinea as Africa's 7th poorest economy, while another ranks it as its 10th richest. Mozambique is similarly ranked as the 8th poorest economy in Africa in one table and the 12th richest in the other, with an economy 10 times larger in one estimate than the other. And Liberia jumps 20 places in the rankings, moving from Africa's 2nd poorest in one ranking to a comfortable mid-rank of 22nd in another. Many of the countries in these rankings jump at least 10 places, and all of this suggests that the use of gross domestic product as a measure for development, particularly in the global south, should be greeted with a high degree of skepticism. So what explains the dramatic shifts that Jervin observes? Put simply, Jervin argues that the numbers are a reflection of poor statistical accounting systems in many sub-Saharan African countries. Research offices are woefully understaffed, and yet government policymakers and development and aid agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations, all regularly make use of these numbers in policy decisions. Take one telling example. In 2014, the government of Nigeria rebased their system of national accounts. Put simply, the government changed its calculation of the gross domestic product of the country to more accurately reflect current prices and market structures. Because it's impossible for a country to actually total the value of all economic activity in the country every year, most countries will do a comprehensive survey every decade or so, getting as complete a picture of the economy as possible. Over, say, the next 10 years, it will use that survey and adjust up or down based on more narrow surveys of indicator sectors. In Nigeria, The last comprehensive survey was done in 1990. That was before the rise of Nollywood, Nigeria's massive film industry, before cell phones and the internet were pervasive. It was before the end of the Cold War. When Nigeria undertook a comprehensive survey and rebased its economy in 2014, it found that the economy was 89% larger than it had previously estimated. Overnight, Nigeria's gross domestic product shot up from about $270 billion to $510 billion, or in per capita terms, it increased from just under $2,000 per person to over $3,800 per person. The move had real policy implications. It caused Nigeria to leapfrog South Africa to become the continent's largest economy, and it moved Nigeria out of the group of highly indebted poor countries, a category that the international financial institutions use to determine eligibility for some concessionary lending and debt forgiveness programs. But while Nigeria's economy seemed to have almost doubled in size, did things on the ground get any better? Was Nigeria really 89% better off on April 30th than it was on April 1st? Did the plight of 100 million Nigerians who live in extreme poverty, representing some 60% of the country's total population, actually improve? Of course not. But from the perspective of gross domestic product per capita, the country was dramatically better off. And Nigeria is hardly alone here. When Ghana rebased their economy in 2010, it increased by nearly 60% in size. Kenya, Tanzania, and Zambia rebased their economies, and when they did, they each found that their economies had grown by about 1/4. And Uganda rebased in 2014, resulting in a 13% increase in the size of their economy. On the other hand, India's rebasing saw the economy shrink slightly, but the growth rate improved in 2015. All of this suggests that we should be careful when relying on gross domestic product as a proxy for thinking about the health of the economy. So that concludes our very brief introduction to gross domestic product. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series, and thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye.